For years, a businessman in Burkina Faso made part of his living by bringing day-old chicks into his country from Morocco and Europe. Every shipment represented more than poultry. It represented a chain of dependence stretching across borders, suppliers, paperwork, airline schedules, and thousands of miles before a farmer could even begin raising a chicken. Now, that same businessman, Mohazu Zongrana, is moving to the other side of the equation. Instead of depending primarily on chicks produced abroad, he has invested in a hatchery inside Burkina Faso with a stated design capacity of more than 10 million chicks a year. That transformation raises a much bigger question. Who should control the starting point of a nation's food supply? Burkina Faso is an agricultural country, yet part of its poultry industry has depended on chicks arriving from foreign suppliers. When availability tightened abroad, transportation became difficult, or young birds suffered stress during long journeys. Local producers carried the consequences. Today, that structure is beginning to change. Under the government of Ibrahim Traore, food sovereignty has become part of a broader national strategy to strengthen domestic production. In the poultry sector, authorities have moved to restrict permits for importing broiler chicks while encouraging local capacity. But this story is not simply about closing a border. It is about whether Burkina Faso can build the farms, hatcheries, skills, technology, energy systems, and businesses necessary to replace part of what it once purchased abroad. And there is another side that deserves attention. Some hatcheries may still need imported hatching eggs and other inputs. Domestic production must also remain affordable and reliable for ordinary farmers. So has Burkina Faso truly reduced dependence or merely moved it one step further up the supply chain? That is what we are going to examine, from a hatchery designed for millions of chicks to locally developed solar-powered incubators built for rural conditions. If you want to follow the economic changes reshaping Africa beyond the headlines, stay with this channel as we follow where these experiments lead. Because this is ultimately not just a story about chickens, it is about who produces, who earns, and who controls the first link in the food chain. To understand why Burkina Faso is making this change, we first need to understand what dependence looks like on the ground. For businesses importing day-old chicks, the journey could begin hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Suppliers in Morocco and Europe provided chicks that then had to reach Burkina Faso quickly enough to remain healthy. But a living chick is not an ordinary shipment. Importers depended on documentation, foreign suppliers having enough chicks available, airline schedules, and reliable transportation. If any part of that chain failed, the consequences could reach a farmer in Burkina Faso who had never crossed the country's border. Mohazu Zongrana knew that system firsthand. As an importer, he faced difficulties securing the necessary documents and obtaining chicks when foreign suppliers had limited availability. Air transportation created another challenge, and after the chicks finally began their journey, long-distance travel could cause stress and mortality before they reached local farms. There was another vulnerability beyond transportation. Foreign suppliers naturally had their own domestic customers to serve. When demand increased in the countries producing the chicks, Burkina Faso could not assume that foreign producers would always have enough capacity available for export. Imports therefore served an important purpose when Burkina Faso lacked sufficient domestic production. They helped farmers obtain chicks and kept poultry businesses operating. But they also placed the beginning of part of the country's poultry supply chain beyond national control. That distinction matters. A farmer may own the land, a local business may own the chicken house. Workers may raise the birds inside Burkina Faso. But if the first critical input depends on a supplier abroad, disruption outside the country can still determine what happens inside the farm. This is the structural problem behind the current shift. The goal is not simply to replace a foreign chick with a Burkinabe chick. It is to shorten the chain between the hatchery and the farmer, reduce exposure to transportation problems, and keep more productive activity inside the country. But doing that requires more than political determination. Burkina Faso first has to prove that its own hatcheries can deliver enough healthy chicks at prices local farmers can afford. And that requirement would soon put government policy to a very practical test. In 2025, Burkina Faso moved from discussing dependence to testing whether domestic producers could replace part of it. The government suspended the issuance of permits for importing broiler chicks. The distinction is important. This was not a blanket prohibition on every type of poultry entering Burkina Faso. The measure specifically targeted chicks intended for meat production and was presented as a response to growing domestic capacity. That decision changed the incentives facing the industry. For years, importing chicks could be an easier business model than building hatcheries at home. Now, the government was signaling that future demand should increasingly be supplied by producers operating inside Burkina Faso. But restricting imports creates responsibilities of its own. If local hatcheries cannot supply enough chicks, farmers may face shortages. If domestic producers gain protection from foreign competition and then raise prices, smaller poultry farmers may pay the bill. And if expansion happens too quickly without strong veterinary controls, poor quality chicks or disease could undermine confidence in the entire strategy. Burkina Faso's authorities appear to recognize those risks. Officials have discussed veterinary monitoring, access to animal health products, financing for producers, and measures intended to keep chicks affordable. The government also moved toward regulating domestic prices rather than simply allowing protected producers to charge whatever the market would bear. Enforcement has become another part of the story. Official figures reported that more than 135,000 illegally imported day-old chicks were seized and destroyed during 2025, compared with 19,000 the previous year. That sharp increase suggests that changing the legal market does not automatically eliminate demand for foreign supply. It may instead push some trade outside official channels if domestic availability and prices fail to satisfy farmers. That is why the real test of this policy is not how many import permits Burkina Faso stops issuing. The test is whether a farmer can obtain a healthy chick when he needs it, at a price that allows him to make a living. If domestic producers can meet that standard, import restrictions may give a young industry room to grow. If they cannot, sovereignty could become another cost placed on the farmer. And that brings us to the businessmen now being asked to prove that local production can actually work. One of the clearest signs that this policy is changing economic behavior can be found in the story of Muhazu Zongrana. He knew the import business from the inside. Instead of remaining dependent on foreign hatcheries, he moved toward producing chicks inside Burkina Faso through Couvoir Mariama. The scale of that transition is significant. The hatchery was developed on roughly 9.9 acres of land and has a stated design capacity of about 10.4 million chicks per year. That number requires an important qualification. It represents design capacity, not proof that 10.4 million chicks are already being produced and sold every year. Another operation, Tapsoba et Frères, has been reported with a nominal capacity of roughly 6 million chicks annually. Together, the two facilities represent about 16.4 million chicks per year in stated capacity. Again, capacity is not the same as actual production, but the direction of investment matters. Money that once helped purchase finished chicks from suppliers abroad can now finance hatchery buildings, equipment, local transportation, veterinary services, distribution, and jobs inside Burkina Faso. Couvoir Mariama alone has been reported to support around 60 direct jobs. The wider economic effect could extend further through farms, feed suppliers, animal health services, maintenance, and transportation, although reliable figures for those indirect jobs are not yet available. This is why the transition from importer to producer matters more than a slogan about buying local. Zongrana already understood the market. He knew farmers needed chicks because he has spent years helping supply that demand through imports. Now, part of that commercial experience is being redirected toward producing the same critical inputs at home. If the model succeeds, Burkina Faso keeps more than chicks within its borders. It keeps more work, more technical experience, more investment, and a larger share of the value created by its own poultry market. Yet, large hatcheries solve only one side of the problem. Burkina Faso also has thousands of producers operating far from major industrial facilities and, in some places, without dependable electricity. For them, the next question is different. Can the technology needed to produce chicks also be designed for the realities of rural Burkina Faso? Large industrial hatcheries may provide scale, but another experiment in Burkina Faso addresses a different problem: how to produce chicks where infrastructure is less dependable. That is where Eugene Ruamba and the Burkinabe company Miaba entered the story. Ruamba's work on incubators began years before the current government of Ibrahim Traore. That distinction matters because this technology should not be presented as an invention created by the present administration. It grew from local experimentation and practical problems faced by poultry producers. Over time, Miaba developed different generations of incubators, moving from smaller machines towards systems capable of handling thousands of eggs. At one rural production site, a hybrid incubator can hold about 6,000 eggs. The process is surprisingly easy to understand. Selected eggs spend roughly 18 days in incubation before being transferred to separate hatching units. Some of those hatches can hold around 2,000 eggs. Gas provides heat, while the electrical system powered by solar energy supports ventilation and the equipment used to control temperature and humidity. A thermostat helps regulate the internal environment, while an automatic turning system moves the eggs during incubation. Humidity is another critical part of the process. During incubation, the system generally operates around 50 to 60% humidity. When the eggs enter the hatching stage, humidity can be increased to around 70%. The additional moisture helps soften conditions around the shell so the chick can break through more easily. None of these functions sounds revolutionary by itself. What makes the system important is where it is intended to work. A machine designed for rural Burkina Faso cannot assume that every farmer has access to the same electrical infrastructure available in a major city or industrial zone. That changes the meaning of innovation. The best technology is not always the most complicated or the most expensive. Sometimes it is the technology that can survive local conditions, be repaired locally, and continue working when infrastructure is unreliable. And once incubation reaches that point, another question becomes unavoidable. If electricity cannot always be trusted, how much of the energy needed to produce the next generation of chickens can come directly from the Sahel's most abundant resource, the sun? For a hatchery, electricity is not simply a matter of convenience. A power failure at the wrong moment can threaten an entire batch of developing chicks. Inside an incubator, eggs need stable heat, controlled humidity, and continuous ventilation. The developing embryos need oxygen, and sudden changes in their environment can reduce the chances of a successful hatch. That makes unreliable electricity a serious production risk, especially in rural areas. Miaba's response has been practical rather than ideological. Instead of depending entirely on one energy source, its hybrid system combines solar power with gas. Solar electricity helps operate ventilation and control systems. Gas supplies the heat needed to maintain the incubator's internal temperature. The result is not complete energy independence. Gas still has to be purchased and transported, and equipment still requires maintenance. But the company is already experimenting with another step. Researchers have been working on ways to capture solar heat directly so that the incubator can reduce its gas consumption during the hottest part of the day. Reported trials suggest that under suitable conditions, stored solar heat may help support operation for roughly 12 hours before gas is needed again. That matters in the Sahel, where intense sunlight is often treated as an environmental challenge. Here, the same sunlight can become a productive asset. The larger lesson goes beyond one incubator. If Burkina Faso wants poultry production to expand beyond major cities and industrial centers, equipment must function under the conditions farmers actually face. A machine that works perfectly only with uninterrupted grid electricity may have limited value in a village where power is uncertain. Local engineering can change that calculation. Mayaba has also reportedly supplied equipment beyond Burkina Faso to other markets in the region. That creates an interesting possibility. African technology does not always have to move from Europe or Asia into Africa. A solution developed for conditions in Burkina Faso can potentially move from one African country to another. That is a small example of what technological sovereignty could look like in practice. Yet, even a locally designed incubator powered partly by the Sahel sun cannot answer one uncomfortable question. Where do the eggs placed inside that machine come from? And on that point, Burkina Faso's journey toward poultry sovereignty is still incomplete. The answer reveals why Burkina Faso's move toward poultry sovereignty should be understood as a process, not a finished victory. Producing a chick inside Burkina Faso does not necessarily mean every part of that chick's production began inside the country. Mohazu Zungrana has indicated that during the initial stage of local production, hatching eggs would still need to be imported. The longer-term intention is to produce those eggs inside Burkina Faso as domestic capacity develops. That distinction gives us 3 levels of dependence. At the first level, a country imports day-old chicks that are ready to be delivered to poultry farmers. At the second level, it imports fertile hatching eggs but performs incubation, hatching, vaccination, sorting, and distribution at home. At the third level, it develops the breeding flocks needed to produce those fertile eggs domestically, allowing even more of the poultry value chain to remain within the country. Burkina Faso is attempting to move upward through those levels, but it has not completed the journey. And hatching eggs are not the only consideration. A modern poultry industry also depends on animal feed, veterinary medicines, vaccines, replacement parts, breeding stock, energy, specialized equipment, and people with the technical knowledge to operate and repair that equipment. Trying to eliminate every foreign input would be neither realistic nor necessary. Food sovereignty does not have to mean economic isolation. A more practical definition is the ability of a country to control a larger share of the critical production chain and to withstand disruptions when foreign supply becomes uncertain. Seen that way, moving incubation into Burkina Faso already matters. Local workers can gain skills. Farmers can receive chicks produced closer to home. Businesses can build technical experience. And money that once paid for a finished imported chick can support more economic activity inside the country. But the next test is harder. Can Burkina Faso eventually produce more of its own hatching eggs, breeding stock, equipment, and other essential inputs without sacrificing quality or affordability? That question takes this story beyond a few hatcheries. It leads directly to the broader political vision that has made food sovereignty a national priority under President Ibrahim Traore. The poultry story becomes more significant when placed inside the broader economic direction of Ibrahim Traore's government. Traore did not invent the Mwayaba incubator, nor is there evidence that he personally created Couvoir Mariama. Local entrepreneurs and engineers deserve credit for those projects. His influence appears at a different level. Under his government, food sovereignty has been elevated into a national objective. The agricultural and livestock offensive launched for 2023 through 2025 was designed to increase domestic production, strengthen food security, create employment, and reduce vulnerabilities that come with dependence on outside supply. That helps explain why the transformation of an importer into a producer matters politically. The government's message is not simply that Burkina Faso should purchase fewer foreign products. The more consequential idea is that the country should develop the capacity to produce more of what its people already consume. And public resources have followed that objective. In May 2025, Traore's government presented agricultural, livestock, and fisheries equipment and inputs valued at more than 104 billion West African CFA francs. At the reference exchange rate used for this story, That represents roughly 186 million United States dollars. That money was not dedicated exclusively to poultry, and it would be misleading to suggest otherwise. It supported a much broader agricultural and livestock strategy, but the scale shows that food sovereignty is being treated as more than political language. The private sector remains essential. A government can restrict imports, provide equipment, and establish priorities, but it cannot hatch millions of healthy chicks by decree. Entrepreneurs must invest. Technicians must operate the equipment. Farmers must trust the product enough to buy it. This is where Traore's influence can ultimately be measured. If policy encourages businesses that once made money importing finished products to invest instead in productive capacity at home, the structure of the economy begins to change. Supporters of Traore can reasonably see that as progress, but the strongest case for his approach will not come from speeches or political symbolism. It will come from results. If Burkina Faso produces more, creates durable jobs, keeps chicks affordable, and steadily reduces vulnerable points in its supply chain, food sovereignty becomes something farmers can actually experience. And those results provide a far stronger argument than any slogan ever could. Any serious discussion of Burkina Faso's strategy also has to consider the criticism. It would be easy to claim that France, the United States, or the European Union became angry because Burkina Faso decided to produce its own chicks. But there is no reliable evidence supporting that specific claim. The real Western and international criticism is broader. Economic institutions have long warned that protectionism can reduce competition, raise costs, discourage investment, and create shortages when domestic industries are not ready to meet demand. That concern deserves to be taken seriously in Burkina Faso. If imported chicks disappear while local hatcheries cannot produce enough, farmers could face shortages. If protected producers charge excessive prices, the cost of sovereignty could fall on small poultry farmers. And if Burkina Faso still imports hatching eggs, medicines, breeding stock, or specialized equipment, one form of dependence may simply be replaced by another. But there is an important counter-argument. Temporary protection can give a developing domestic industry room to expand when it is combined with investment, quality standards, veterinary support, financing, and competition among local producers. That is where Burkina Faso's experiment becomes more interesting. The country is not relying only on an import restriction. Large hatcheries are being developed, authorities have addressed domestic pricing, veterinary monitoring is part of the strategy. Local engineers are developing incubators adapted to rural conditions. Producers are also discussing the longer-term goal of producing hatching eggs at home. Western media criticism of Ibrahim Traore often focuses on entirely different questions, including military rule, democratic governance, human rights, security, and Burkina Faso's changing international relationships. Those debates should not be falsely presented as Western opposition to local chicken production. The poultry policy deserves its own test. Are farmers receiving enough healthy chicks? Are prices affordable? Is domestic production actually increasing? Are jobs and technical skills being created? And is Burkina Faso becoming less vulnerable to disruptions outside its borders? Those questions offer a more useful measure than political applause from supporters or criticism from opponents. If the answers improve over time, Burkina Faso will have evidence that greater local control can work. If they do not, blaming foreign critics will not solve the problem. Burkina Faso's poultry experiment offers Africa a lesson that is larger than chickens. The lesson is not that every African country should close its borders and stop importing. No country needs to manufacture everything it consumes. The deeper question is whether African economies can control more of the value created by the needs of their own people. Burkina Faso is testing one answer. An importer is becoming a producer. Large hatcheries are creating domestic capacity. Local engineers are adapting incubators to rural conditions. Solar energy is helping address unreliable electricity. And government policy is trying to give domestic businesses room to compete. But success is not guaranteed. Burkina Faso still needs affordable chicks, reliable quality, stronger breeding capacity, veterinary services, feed, equipment, and eventually more locally produced hatching eggs. Sovereignty will mean little if ordinary farmers cannot afford the result. That is also the lesson for Mali, Niger, and the wider Sahel. Build capacity before restricting imports. Develop the entire value chain instead of replacing only the final imported product. Give private businesses a reason to invest. And design technology for African conditions rather than assuming that every imported solution will fit local realities. Regional cooperation matters as well. The African Union and governments across West Africa should not have to choose between national production and African trade. A machine designed in Burkina Faso could serve a farmer in Mali. Knowledge developed in Niger could support producers elsewhere. Policies associated with Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani will ultimately be judged by whether they create durable, productive capacity, not simply political symbolism. The same standard should apply when discussing France or other outside partners. Trade with the world is not the opposite of sovereignty. Dependence without alternatives is the greater danger. That is why this story belongs in Africa News. If Burkina Faso can turn domestic demand into local investment, jobs, skills, and technology, its experience may offer something other African countries can study without copying blindly. And if you want to follow how these economic experiments reshape Africa, continue following this channel. The question is no longer simply whether Africa should import less. It is whether Africa can produce more value for itself and decide from a position of greater strength what it still chooses to buy from the world. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.